Thank you very much. I think in terms of time, we are coping very well. We are going to have our second series of keynote on the last two themes of the Policy Dialogue Forum. So our two presentations of this session will be on financing teaching and teacher development. Well, we saw what we want about teacher education, what we said about teaching and learning, but do we have the interpretation?
Yeah.
Can you hear me now? Can you hear me now? Okay, they are talking about the screen. The speaker, this speaker is not working. Do we have a technician in the house? Yes. Thank you. Otherwise, they will shoot me. Okay, while he's fixing that, let me remind you that when we finish here, immediately after we finish, we invite you all to the third floor for the exhibition. A lot of colleagues, a lot of organizations, a lot of individual project organizers have brought materials that are useful for the presentations that we are discussing. So if you want to take away some of the copies of those materials, we will just introduce them first to you upstairs on the third floor at the end of this session. And if you are one of those people who have brought boxes and the boxes are not open and the material display yet, please run immediately after session to set up before the crowd comes. Thank you. So I would like to introduce you Professor Alexei Semenov from Moscow State University of Education, who will be the moderator of this session. And the session on financing, teaching, and teacher development will be presented by, the keynote will be presented by Halsey Rogers from the World Bank. And the session on monitoring and evaluation in teacher development by Albert Motivant, my good colleague from Montreal. And we will have the session with the conclusion by Professor Semenov.
Okay. Policy, service delivery in education, and aid effectiveness. Before joining the bank, Mr. Rogers served as a staff economist at the U.S. Council of Economic Advisors in Washington, D.C., and the Indonesian Ministry of Finance in Jakarta. And he has also had research positions at University of California at Berkeley and the Career Development Institute in Seoul. He holds PhD in economics from the University of California, Berkeley. Yes, please, Mr. Rogers.
Great. Thank you very much, Professor Semenov. And thank you again to the Teacher Task Force and the Government of Mexico for the invitation. I'm very happy to be here. Could I have my presentation? Great. Thank you. So I'm going to be talking about financing for teaching and teacher development, considerations for achieving the SDGs. And I'll explain in a minute what I mean by the considerations for achieving them. Let me open by saying something about the World Development Report 2018. As Professor Semenov mentioned, it's just been announced that the World Development Report, which is the major annual report that the World Bank puts out every year across all fields, will be on education next year. Actually, it will come out in 2018. It will be entitled Realizing the Promise of Education for Development. And I'm going to be one of the two co-directors along with Dion Filmer from our research department. This is very exciting for us because in the years that had the World Development Report at the World Bank, this is the first one devoted entirely to education. We have in the past had a number of WDRs that focused in on education as part of a broader topic, such as the World Development Report on Service Delivery in 2004 that covered education, health, social protection, and has done a lot to influence our approach to education, the World Bank. But it's really exciting for us that this one is devoted specifically to education. And we think this is really a strong statement by the president of the World Bank, by the institution, about the centrality of education for the SDGs, for meeting the SDGs, and particularly for the fact that we've had a great accumulation of evidence on what works over the past 15 years or so. And now looking ahead to the 2030 goals, it's understood, I think now widely, how central and how important education is to achieving not only the SDG 4 and SDG 16, as we've heard, but all the goals. The themes, we don't even have a team yet. We're just starting to put together a team, but we do know some of the key themes that we want to emphasize. The first one is on the promise of education, something I don't need to convince any of you of. You all know the returns to education, not just economically, but in terms of citizenship, in terms of gender equity, in terms of so many other areas, peace, etc. So we will lay that out strongly for those who are not in the education field. We'll also talk about the progress and the pitfalls in education over the past 15 years or so, all the progress that we made under the MDGs, but also all the gaps, particularly in learning, but also in access that we need to move forward on. And again, this is very familiar to all of you. I'm going to focus a little more in this talk on the next two parts and linking those to financing, the issue of teacher financing. The next one is on evidence on how to improve our progress toward these goals and these very ambitious goals that we've now agreed to with the SDGs. And here we want to show that there's really been a proliferation of good, rigorous evidence that's the type that we can make policy on much than some of the evidence we had in the past 15 years ago. And that also is much more convincing to ministries of finance, to donors, to others that are deciding how much money to put into education. And then the fourth main theme will be about, well, how do we scale up to systemic change? It's not enough to have evidence that this intervention here or this program here is effective, even if it's very good, rigorous evidence. We need to be able to move beyond that and make a convincing case and figure out how to scale these results up to the level of the education sector as a whole. So in the remainder of this talk, I'm going to talk about how, on the issue of financing teachers and teacher development, we should be thinking, in my view, about applying these themes of evidence and scaling up to systemic change when we consider issues of teaching, financing teaching, and teacher development. So what could this mean for financing teaching? Here are some examples that I think will be useful perhaps to keep in mind under both the evidence-based policy and systemic improvement. So first, we need to have strong evidence on what the shortcomings and needs are. Often the needs can be overwhelming in some contexts, but it's important to have good evidence on what the greatest needs are. What are the real bottlenecks for the next stage of progress? Also to have clearly defined causal chains. There is a tendency, or there has been in the past, a tendency in education to think if we put money into education, we will get results. We all have good intentions. We all care deeply about these educational outcomes, but the causal chain from the spending to the outcomes we care about in terms of better teaching and learning is not always well specified or well documented. And I think it's important to make that case strongly. Rigorous evaluation of impacts. Here, I would say the education sector has really been leading the way. It's been, at least from the perspective of the World Bank, we would say all the fields of development that we're active in, education has been one of them, I think, the best at trying to get out in front and say, okay, we understand it's important to show rigorously using counterfactuals, meaning using the appropriate comparison groups, whether a given program or policy is making a difference. And I think it's important to continue that in the area of teacher financing. Triangulation of different information and data sources. We're going to hear from Albert about a lot of data sources. UIS is a great source. We've already heard about Thales in the previous session. We now have a lot of terrific information sources in education. The key is really not to rely on any one, but to triangulate and see, to understand what's effective in teacher financing in terms of getting outcomes. And then this, I'd also like to stress the theme of constant learning and improvement. I think this is part of the virtuous cycle of professionalization that we heard about in the previous session from Juan Diaz de la Torre, which is really, we need to be learning constantly. We need to be feeding back into the policymaking process, into the program design, what is working effectively, what is raising the stature and status of teachers, and also improving their performance and their ability to deliver in the classroom. But we also need to think about systemic improvement. This has all been specific to particular teacher policies and programs, but we need to go beyond effective programs to change at scale. Very often we're able to point to an effective program, but then we don't really know how to scale it up to the teaching force as a whole or to all classrooms. And that may be because we put in more resources than normal. Hello? Okay. That may be because we've put more resources than normal into the pilot, and so we've been able to make it effective, but we haven't always done it with attention to whether we're going to be able to scale it up to the system as a whole. We also heard in the previous session about this interconnection, I think from Dr. Syed, interconnection among the different factors. It's very important to be able to look beyond the teaching policy. We also heard from Juan Diaz de la Torre, the idea that it's not only effective teachers that make for great education and great learning, even though they're the central factor. We have to make sure they're being supported effectively by all the other factors, whether it's classroom infrastructure, whether it's textbooks, whether it's good management, et cetera. So that's what I mean by let's think about systemic improvement and not just effectiveness of particular teacher policies and programs. I think it's crucial to keep these ideas in mind, and I'm not going to talk in the remaining time about specific numbers or dollar amounts that you would want to put into teacher finance. And I know this will be a surprise to some people. I met our colleague from Saudi Arabia at breakfast this morning, and I introduced myself. I said I was from the World Bank, and he had a one-word response, which was money. We're not just about money, and there's a reason for that, because there's a lot of money going into education. We definitely need more in certain areas, but we also need to spend it as effectively as possible to get the results we need. And so we're going to have a lot of discussions about financing particular programs, particular policies in the coming years and months in these international fora. Also domestically, there's, I think in many cases, there are going to be appropriate pressures to focus on financing teachers. Let's also think about how to make sure those resources are spent as effectively as possible. So we need this solid direction to the financing for it to be effective. I would say the key is really to orient these discussions, including maybe starting tomorrow, toward the long-term goals we're trying to meet in terms of effective teaching and learning in the classroom. The alternative, and my fear, is that 5, 10, 15 years from now, when we look back, we realize perhaps we have persuaded people to put more money into teaching, which they must, but we don't get the results that we want to see. And so it's very important that we not be looking back 10 years from now and saying, why did we not design this as effectively as possible to make sure that that funding really made a difference? And I have some experience with this. I know we have some colleagues here from Indonesia. Over the past 10 years, we've been working with the Indonesian government, which has made a major push admirably to try to professionalize, improve the status of their teaching profession. They've spent billions of dollars in the process in raising teacher salaries, in trying to strengthen teachers' system would like it to in the way that we know is effective, and whether students are learning or not. And learning here is defined broadly in ways that I'm sure Albert will probably talk about. Policy goal 7 is supporting teachers to improve instruction. This is really about professional development, which we've also just talked about. And then 8th is motivating teachers to perform, because there are quite a number of systems we work in where motivation is a big problem. It's not only a question of equipping teachers, it's also a question of making sure that they are going to use their skills to the best advantage for their students. So in the 5 minutes I have left, let me just go over how we would apply these WDR principles, or proto-principles before we even write anything, to 3 of these policy goals. So 3 examples. Let me take attracting the best into teaching, which clearly involves financing, supporting teachers, so professional development, again, a major expenditure of this education system, and motivating teachers to perform, which also involves teacher pay as a major component. So the first one, attracting the best into teaching. So what would it mean to have an evidence-based here? So a first step is to really have evidence on intake and turnover and get a sense of what the margin is for improvement. Often we know teacher salaries are low in many countries, but they're lower in some in relative terms than in others. And it's important to be able to look at teachers' behavior and see, is your binding constraint right now, is the main problem the teacher salaries, or is it some other aspect of their work? And you can get a sense of that by looking at who you're attracting into the profession, how many teachers are leaving the profession in the first few years, as we heard in the previous session. Evidence on competing careers, what other options for teachers and how compete with those other options. Causal chain, so how long will the improvement take and why? This came up in the Indonesia example, where one of the major mechanisms by which they were going to be strengthening teaching and learning was by attracting better people into the classroom, into the teaching profession. That's important, but we have to recognize that's a very long-term strategy. It takes perhaps 10 to 15 years before you have a really large share of the teaching force having turned over with stronger new candidates. So you have to work very hard with those who are currently teachers. Systemic, so we think about a systemic approach. What does that mean? So that means working at scale. Can we go beyond, for example, if you're trying to attract high quality teachers into the profession, in some countries they experiment with things like Teach for All. That place, but that clearly is not going to solve, the numbers aren't big enough to solve the problem of quality in the profession overall. Interplay, so the interaction between different factors and different goals. Are new teachers supported sufficiently? So maybe we're attracting good people into the profession, but it turns out they're not getting the support they need in the early years. They're not getting the mentoring we heard about in the previous session, the induction programs, and therefore they're dropping out. Not necessarily because of pay, it could be because of something else. Let me do a second example, supporting teachers to improve instruction. What does it mean to be evidence-based when we're dealing with professional? One is evidence on teachers' weaknesses. Where do teachers need and where do they want help? Where do they think they need help? Because it's unlikely to be effective training unless it's directed toward areas where teachers believe they need help. They aren't like chain. Causal chain, same point, is, from the other aspect, is professional development targeted at known weaknesses? Is there a system for that? Triangulation, so these teacher surveys like TALIS are useful in telling us, do teachers find the PD useful? But then we also need to triangulate. It's not enough just to get the teacher's impressions. We also need mechanisms for seeing whether the professional development actually affects learning in the classroom. And this is one that I think we've really been weak on as a sector in the past. And it's really crucial to push forward with that. And that's something we're trying to help some governments do now. We can do that with direct teacher observation of a sample of teachers, for example. We can do that by looking at effects on learning. If you set up the experiment correctly, there are a lot of ways to do it. The key is to try. And then systemic, at scale, are successful programs replicable at scale affordably? We may have a very good PD program, but it may have been so expensive that we can't scale it up. And is it reaching, well, sorry, interplay, do teachers have incentives to apply what they learn? The point I made earlier, that it's not enough to have the skills, they also need the incentives to apply what they've learned. And then the final goal, let me just talk about motivating teachers. So motivating teachers to perform evidence-based. So performance, we need to know, is low motivation affecting the quality of teaching? In some systems, that doesn't seem to be a problem. In other systems, we have very strong evidence that it is. Impact, so do we have good evidence on whether incentives defined broadly, that doesn't mean test score-based bonuses, it means incentives like, for example, it could be professional recognition, it could be bonuses of certain types. There are many ways to provide incentives, but do they affect how teachers feel and how they act? cost. What is the most cost-effective approach? We may have a variety of ways to improve motivation, but some will be much more cost-effective than others, and we now have some good research on that. And then systemic, at scale, can we motivate teachers everywhere, i.e. especially in the remote areas where often the problems are most serious? And do motivated teachers, once we get them motivated, do they have the skills and tools they need? So that takes us back to some of the other policy goals. So in short, how do we ensure that this financing adds up to achieving the SDGs? I think one important step is to screen all policies, programs, systemic reform plans by asking the question of whether they're evidence-based and whether they can contribute to systemic improvements, not just narrow improvements. Essentially, this adds up to, as again we heard in the previous session, I think it's not just about effective teachers, it's about effective teaching and learning. And if we apply all this, we can have real promise at getting to effective teaching and learning. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Rogers. I think we'll have it after the second presentation today, and please prepare questions. We'll have short time, but some we will have. So the next floor will be of the Albert Motivans presenting here UNESCO Institute for Statistics. The World Bank does not need any introduction, but I think that as well everybody knows and understand how important UNESCO Institute for Statistics is for our work. So Albert Motivans heads the Education Indicators and Data Analysis section of the UNESCO Institute for Statistics, and he's responsible for development and analysis of cross-national educational indicators for benchmarking and monitoring progress towards the international targets. He has written widely on global education trends and the use of indicators for policy analysis. He has worked more in the field of measurement of child welfare for the last 20 years in the Bureau. He's an organizer and author of multiple studies and reports, and I would mention something which is very important, I think, for all of us, is research on dropouts in primary schools. I think it's something which is take care of all the countries here. Okay, so welcome.
Okay, thank you. Okay, is it on? Yeah. Okay, I'm sorry. Okay, so thank you very much, Chair. So thank you very much, Chair. As was mentioned about introductions with the World Bank and the single word response, I have to say that for us from UNESCO Institute for Statistics, there's also a one-word response, and typically it's data. So I want to say actually a little bit more about what's underlying some of this data and what's behind some of the data. But at the same time, I have to say I think I'm rather jealous of the other presenters, because I think what I'm going to be presenting now is something which we've been working on for 2 years, but has really meant to reduce the scope, to reduce indicators, to really focus on policy amenable, practical indicators that can be communicated easily, and not so much capturing the potential for research around teacher development and teachers that we've heard about both in the session on TALIS and in the session we just heard now from the World Bank. I think there's enormous potential and lots of things that can happen. So I'll have to be careful about balancing some of that, and I'll return to that in just a moment. So as we've heard both this morning at the opening and through the sessions today, in order to effectively manage education systems, and especially teaching forces, it's not only in terms of quantity, but also in quality. One needs the relevant data and evidence to monitor, track progress. And I think Mexico provided a good example this morning of steps that it's taken to improve its approach to data and evidence, both with the identifying the problem of not being able to have reliable teacher headcounts and proposing a new school census, and also collecting other about the conditions of work of teachers and conditions of school. But also by establishing the new Institute of Education Evaluation, which I think is bringing serious technical rigor to a lot of the questions and problems that not only Mexico faces, but that many countries in the world face. So I want to talk about three things, and they're not as exciting as some of the other presentations. I want to talk a little bit about the process. How did we get to where we are today with the SDGs? You may see that some of these indicators at the end, and you wonder, well, who decided that, or the targets? And I think, for example, Yusuf Said this morning or this afternoon, wording of the targets, whether that was really the best wording possible, and some of the big gaps there, as we've heard about in terms of trying to capture quality. I think that's something I can kind of briefly describe. And then also the indicators, and what are the indicators? What will be monitored at the global level? What will be monitored at other levels? And then talk a little bit about challenges and some of the next steps and where we go from here. Sorry, I have to make sure that okay. So let's start with okay, so let's start with the development agenda and goals. And as we've heard already many times, and I think when you leave this conference, you'll be able to repeat it word for word. The new goal on education by 2030 to ensure that all girls and boys complete free, equitable, and quality primary and secondary education, leading to relevant and effective learning. And somehow that doesn't look right to me. There should be lifelong learning in there. Boy, I better check that. In any case, let me focus then on the targets, and I think some of the key characteristics of the targets that are different and that are important, not only especially for thinking about teachers and teaching. So one is the lifelong learning approach. So as my goal doesn't do, the actual goal does look at the importance of learning and education from the view of and it's trying to capture really all of the learning that takes place across one's life. I think that's really important, but that also sets the bar high. So that's a very big ambition, really, to look at the entire agenda all at once. Two themes that come out of the targets that are important are around quality and equity, and we've heard about both today already. And when we look at the targets and then the indicators that match up with these targets, there's a strong focus on outputs and outcomes. So if you look at the targets, I think 5 of the 11 global targets have something to do with measuring learning outcomes or assessing learning outcomes. And I think it was right for one of the previous speakers to raise this issue about interrogating this and what are the implications for teachers relative to that focus on learning assessment. Another aspect is around equity and this idea that there should be disaggregation across all possible indicators. And that's relevant also for teachers, not only for children, youth, and adults. I think the other point, which was very powerfully shown in the previous panel, was that a good quality teacher has an enormous impact on the life chances of a child. So when we think about equity, about who has access to the quality teacher, what we'll measure are really important, because I think through these means of implementation, through the indicators that will be presented on these areas, it's at least one way to start the discussion around what has changed in terms of learning outcomes. Okay, so I think this is really one of the most important slides in my presentation, because I think it's a nice key for understanding what this is all about. And I think it really kind of helps to clarify what it is that we're talking about at these different terms that I throw around: monitoring, thematic monitoring, national monitoring. What do we mean by that? This chart actually was part of the UN Secretary General's report, and the idea was to kind of set out a framework for looking at how are we going to monitor. And so you can see it starts at the top with the national, and of course this is really the most important level of monitoring. This is the link to the national plan. This is the focus on how systems are defined in terms of policy and legislation. There's the consultation of national stakeholders, which is important. I think something that's really important is about recognizing context. I think that's what's the wonderful thing that some of these other SABER and context that is specific to the national level. There's also a regional level. There's frameworks which are being developed and actually aligned to the SDGs in a number of regions, and I think we'll see one for Latin America and the Caribbean as well. But the African Union is already moving ahead with African Union 2063. And then another example is the European Union 2020, which isn't really aligned to the SDGs, just another example of how some of these indicators are used and monitored at a regional level. So then I want to talk, for the rest of my presentation, I really want to talk about the next two levels, and that's the thematic and the monitor and the global, and try to explain those a little bit better and how they came to be and why they are the way they are and what's in them. But you see, there's a lot of interesting things at the national level that I won't be able to discuss in a way. And if you look at it in a way, I mean, I think it's very helpful to kind of pyramid shape, because it's not only between, going between national and global, it's also going from very many indicators, a wide array of indicators, like we've seen today, that capture comprehensively a national system of and national teaching forces, to one that's very narrow. So one, we go from maybe hundreds of indicators that could be used for policy to 11 at the global level. So there's a big difference, and that signals something already beyond what I mentioned already, which was about context. I mean, certainly those ones at the national level are going to reflect national context better than ones which are standardized across countries and which are chosen because many countries are able to report on them. So there's that kind of tension between context and standardization, and more indicators and less indicators, but also in terms of the use and the purpose of these indicators. You know, people get very invested in discussing the indicators, but I think, you know, it does look reductionist to have one indicator on teachers, on the teacher target, but in a way, it's not meant to inform policy in the same way that indicators at the thematic level or at the national level might be. It's meant to be a kind of a signal light thing, like something which it could be understood quickly and which can kind of raise interest and can be used as an advocacy type of indicator, versus the national level, where we really want to get into the nitty-gritty of what's happening in the country. And then, of course, what we want to see is those global 11 indicators still be reproducible across all the different levels. But we still want to see those at the national level, not only at the global and thematic. So let me talk a little bit about these global and thematic indicators. First of all, how they were chosen. So there were parallel exercises, but they were very strongly linked processes. So at the global level, there were 28 member states that led the interagency and expert group in the UN. International organizations like UNESCO were not invited to be participants. We were just observers. So this was really led by countries. So if you're not happy with the targets and such, you can talk to your representatives who represent you in the UN. But of course, it's getting to that list is really, I think, quite an achievement, given all of the different values, attitudes, approaches that countries have. So I don't want to criticize it in any way, because I think it really is quite an achievement. At the thematic level, it was a little bit different. So it wasn't, and the ask was a lot different. So at the global level, they were looking not just at education, but as we heard, across 17 goals and 169 targets, and education was only a part of that. At the thematic level, and just to say that other sectors are also doing thematic monitoring. So health has their thematic framework. Water and sanitation has their own framework. So there's also that happening, not just in education, in other sectors. But at the thematic level, it was really kind of defined more by the education community. And it was to kind of try to balance, to give recommendations for other indicators that could be used, because only one indicator was going to be used per target at the global level. So we felt that we could open it up a little bit more and try to bring in more different concepts into the monitoring. And I'll give some examples of that in just a moment. Yeah? Oh, I'm sorry. I'm looking at the wrong one. Sorry, I should have two things. Yeah, I'll be more careful. Sorry. So again, so the difference, the two tracks, the global indicators, is the IAG SDGs, and the thematic indicators was led by what was called the EFA Steering Committee, and that included member states, many of the member states who are in this room now, along with international agencies, civil society, trying to represent all of the education community. Okay, so we've gone from who was responsible to how many indicators. So this doesn't seem very tenable right now, but currently there are 229 indicators for the entire global development framework. So that's not education, that's health, that's poverty, that's environment, that's across all of the different goals. But and already you can see the problem. That's quite something to monitor and to ask to manage on a regular basis. But for education, it's 11 indicators, and there's one for each target. There's a second indicator for early childhood, so that's why there's 11 indicators for the 10 targets and means of implementation. So at the thematic level, there's 43 plus indicators that include the same 11 global indicators, and at the thematic level, there's not one indicator on teachers, but there's 7. Okay, so in terms of what's happening next, I'll go through this quickly so that you know. Just last week, the UN Statistical Commission met to consider the report and the indicator proposal, which includes the indicators which I'm going to show you now. And they passed it, and it'll go now to the ECOSOC, the Economic and Social Commission in the UN, which will then finalize the indicator framework in June. So the IAG SDGs is actually meeting here in Mexico City in just a few weeks, and they'll be setting out different work streams to take forward the framework. In terms of the thematic indicators, the Technical Advisory Group, which is chaired by UIS, is using these thematic indicators. We're waiting to ensure that the global indicators are completely and finally adopted before we change those at the thematic level. We'll look for endorsement of the new Education 2030 Steering Committee, which again is also a very inclusive group representing many different stakeholders in education. And then they'll launch the new Technical Coordination Group to monitor implementation, which will start from that meeting from May. And just to say something about the Technical Coordination Group, that's also countries, civil society, and international organizations, but from the statistical technical side. So our role is not, and that's where UIS plays a role, our role is not in the political side, which is the Education 2030 Steering Committee, but more on the technical side, and we help inform the political side about some of the technical issues. And so that role, I guess, would continue with this new Technical Coordination Group. Okay, so here's the indicator. 5 minutes, okay. So I'll have to move a little bit faster, but just to kind of get to the crux of some of the issues. So this is the global indicator, and as you see, it's not one global indicator, so we lied. So it's not one. It's one for pre-primary, one for primary, one for lower secondary, one for upper secondary, plus disaggregations by sex. So already there you may have 8 indicators when we said it was 1. So already we're cheating a little bit, but really we had to do this. But already you can see some issues. Okay, so this is around receiving minimum organized teacher training or pedagogical training, pre-service or in-service required for teaching at a relevant level in the given country. So it's a minimum standard. So that can be that should be recognized. So that's the global indicator, the one global indicator that will move ahead. But again, it doesn't define the agenda. It's kind of just that kind of one measure which tries to draw attention to issues, which then can open up the dialogue, the conversation about things more broadly. So I'll go quickly to the thematic framework. So instead of 1 indicator, there's 7. And just to say that we tried to look at different concepts, tried to unpack the target a little bit more than the global indicator does, because it's limited, just focusing on one issue. So we focus on qualified, trained, and motivated and supported teachers. And so we developed then indicators, the 7 indicators, to try to capture these concepts. And so some of them we have already, and we have the ability to disaggregate the data. And we have some standards already, but we have issues, both in terms of qualified teachers and in terms of trained teachers. You see here I've marked the trained teachers as the global indicator. So the other indicator that we use is the other indicator in cases we use a pupil trained teacher or pupil qualified teacher ratio by education level. So that's just something that we can do readily given the other indicator. So so let's move on to see what some of the issues are with this indicator. And I think you probably know what it is already. And it is really about using trying to capture an indicator like the proportion of trained primary teachers when the standards for training differ so widely between countries. And not only between countries, but within countries. Standards change often within a country. And so in order to really be able to compare the change in time, one really needs to benchmark a little bit better than some of these indicators, especially if it's going down. And we've seen that quite often, that the standards will go down, oftentimes to bring in new teachers because there's a strong deficit, need for teachers, so to lower the standard. And especially in that case, then when you try to look at these data over time, you're going to get a picture which doesn't make sense. So here we have a number of countries. We're able to report this proportion of trained primary teachers from 80% to 20% among these countries. But again, if we don't know if the training is